So now that we know that it's all about objects and that those objects are built based on classes, the question is, which code do we have to write here to create our own widget class? And the answer to that is that you use the class keyword to tell Dart that you are about to create a class. And then any name of your choice, like gradient container. The name is up to you, but it should follow certain rules. For example, it should start with an uppercase character. And if it consists of multiple words, as this name here does, these words must not be separated by white space or a dash, but instead you should separate them with an underscore, or way better and actually recommended like this. It's all one long word, but the words inside of the word start with another capital character. So that's then the name of your class, and as mentioned, it is up to you. It should just follow some general rules regarding how the name is written, and it should also describe what the class is about, so which kind of object will be created. And here my idea is to create a container widget that will come with a gradient already applied to it. So that name sounds quite fitting. Now you could create a class like this, because in Dart you can also create classes that are not widgets, and in that case you would probably be done at that case. You could add curly braces and add your class logic between those curly braces, just as you add function logic between the curly braces of a custom function. But since this should become a widget, you actually have to add more in front of these curly braces. Because classes can extend other classes. They can inherit features and data and logic from other classes. And that's done by adding the extends keyword, another keyword built into Dart, and then the name of the class from which you want to inherit. And here that's stateless widget, written like this, which is a class that comes from the Flutter framework, and that is available here because of this import which we added at the top at the beginning of this section. So stateless widget is the class from which you want to inherit, and inheriting from that widget does a couple of things. Most importantly, it automatically, behind the scenes, adds a lot of logic and data to this class here without you writing anything between these curly braces. It adds a lot of data and logic that is required by Flutter in order to use this as a widget and add this to a UI. But in addition to adding things behind the scenes, extending from stateless widget actually also forces you to add something to your class. And that's why I'm getting an error here at the moment. Because at the moment I'm not implementing everything in my own class that I should implement. Most importantly, I'm missing a method called build. So therefore, to correctly extend this widget, you should add a new method here called build with parentheses and opening and closing curly braces. So just as you would define a function, but now inside of a class. And you can add functions to classes. We then call these functions typically methods, but it's in the end just a function added to a class, so in the end bound to that class. And this build method here must return a widget. Therefore, you have to add widget in front of build, because as I mentioned earlier already, the thing in front of your function name is the return value type of your function. Now, thus far, we haven't created any functions yet that would return anything, but that's going to change soon. Now, you also should add an annotation in front of your build method, and that's @override. This is technically not required, but you should indeed add it, because this makes it clear that you are in the end overriding a method that is expected by stateless widget. It's simply some extra metadata or annotation added to this method. The more important adjustment that also must be made in addition to adding the type and @override is that build also must accept a parameter. A parameter which you should call context or CTX, though the exact name is up to you. But this is required because indeed this build method will be executed for you by Flutter. Flutter will call this build method once it finds your widget inside of some other widget or passed to the run app function. So basically, whenever Flutter detects your widget in a widget tree, it will call this build method. And this build method will then automatically receive, by Flutter, a value for this context parameter. Now, for the moment, this context parameter doesn't matter. You will see it in action later in this course instead. For the moment, you can simply think of context as a metadata object that contains some useful information about this widget in the overall widget tree. For example, some information about where this widget is positioned in the overall widget tree. Now, between those build method curly braces, you now have to add the body of this function. And here you have to do one important thing. You must return a widget, because widget is the return type of build. Now, up to this point, in all the examples I just showed you from time to time, you always saw void. That's of course also what we have in front of the main function. And void is also the return value of a function, but void is a special value built into Dart, which simply means there is nothing to be returned. So the function should not return any value. And for build, that's different. Build should return a widget. Now, how do you return a value in Dart? Well, inside of the function or method that should return a value, you use the return keyword. And then thereafter the value you want to return. And when a function or method returns a value with that return keyword, that value will be available in the place where the function was called, and it can then be used there. Now, in case of the build method, as mentioned before, it will be Flutter that calls this method for you behind the scenes when it renders the user interface. And Flutter will then take the widget returned by build and make sure that it's reflected on the user interface. So by using return here in this build method, you ensure that Flutter gets access to the widget or to the combination of widgets you want to store in your own custom widget here, because custom widgets in the end are all about storing combinations of other widgets and configurations. So here in this build method, you return the value that will be used by Flutter. For example, some text. Though of course here it's not some text that's wanted, but a widget. And therefore here, instead of returning text, we now go to our main widget tree and select the part of that tree that we want to outsource. In my case, the container widget with all its configuration and child widgets. And we cut that from here and return that in our own widget instead, in the build method after the return keyword. Like this. Container in the end is of type widget, and therefore now here Dart is happy because build does return a widget. So that's the first step. I got some blue squiggly lines here. For the moment we'll ignore them. I'll get back to that soon, but that's the first step. As the next step, we can now use our own custom widget here in our main widget tree, which we pass to run app. And for that, we simply use our widget with its name, in my case gradient container, and add parentheses thereafter. And this calls the constructor function of this class, which in this case is not a function we added explicitly. I'll come back to constructor functions in just a second, but instead for the moment we just call a constructor function that's automatically added to all classes. So even if you don't add your own constructor function explicitly, which you can do, but which we're not doing here, you get one automatically by Dart. And with that, if we save everything and force a reload, this app looks the way it did before, because of course we haven't added any new UI elements, but the fact that it looks like before, and we don't have an error here, shows us that outsourcing this code into a custom widget worked. And this was a crucial step, because you will work with custom widgets all the time when working with Dart and Flutter. You will see it all the time in this course, and you will need this feature all the time in your own projects.